Wordfirst Radio.
Hey, what's up, you guys? Welcome to Wordfirst Radio, the podcast brought to you by Wordfirst Ministries. I am your host, Jacob O'Neill, and as always, I'm joined by my friend Cameron.
Aloha.
And today, Dr. Julian is here once again.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, how you been, man?
Good.
Yeah, it's been too long.
Oh, yeah.
It's been like at least a cup of coffee.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, that's right. So today, we wanted to have you back on to get more specific about this new 2024 revision of the Norwegian translation that's coming out. And today, we're actually going to talk about the things you get angry emails about, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I know you've mentioned some of them in the past, but needless to say, I think we actually mentioned this the first time we had you on. Needless to say, not all of the revisions you make and the changes you make everybody happy.
Yeah.
Some of them actually make people very, very angry. Not just because you're changing the way that they've read the Bible for many years or things like that. That's important, but maybe this goes on like a deeper level where now they're starting to talk about ideologies and doctrines and some of these things that they feel like, the new translation maybe like compromises on something, or the new revision, maybe like compromises on certain things. And so that's one of the things I wanted to maybe put on the table for you to explain, maybe shed some light on that.
Explain yourself.
Explain myself. Yeah, you're not the first one to ask that of me. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I one thing I am happy about is that it engages people, right? And people are, interested and active, and people have good points. There are a lot of emotions when it comes to the biblical languages. I don't know where to start, to be honest, because there have been... Well, I'll take one example that has been perhaps the recently most controversial one.
Yeah.
And it shows how affected we are by the current situation in the world. So this was... I recently started, as I said, I started August 1st, and... then the October 7 attacks in Israel, the Israel-Palestine, situation is not a good word, but let's just put it there. Because John, the Gospel of John is complicated in the sense that he's a very dichotomous type of structures. It's light and dark, it's evil and good, it's... the Jews. And the Jews have been, in large parts of the Gospel of John, the Jews are the enemies of the believers, right? And that has been historically led to a lot of anti-Semitic attitudes, but it's also because it wasn't understood in the appropriate context, right? Which is that the author of the book of John, the disciples and Jesus were all Jews. Right. So when it says that, the disciples were scared of the Jews, the authors, the readers, originally would have understood the context here, right? Which is perhaps it's the Jewish leadership, perhaps it's the... So what we did is that in a few places, 11 places total, we changed the translation from Jews to the Jewish leaders. 2 places we changed it to the crowd. These changes were announced and no one cared because it wasn't really controversial, but suddenly it gained a new perspective. And we've been accused of being anti-Semitic, because we are trying to remove the Jews from the Bible. And we have been accused of the opposite as well.
So that was my first instinct.
But people aren't that open always about accusing us of not being sufficiently anti-Semitic. So that type of criticism has been more subtle. But it was, I got a phone call from one of the Christian newspapers in Norway. They asked about this revision. And I was new, and I said something, and they said, is it due to anti-Semitic reasons? I said, well, we didn't change it because we wanted to, avoid anti-Semitism, but I see that as a positive outcome. It should be less used to be anti-Semitic. And that could turn into, we made a change because we wanted to avoid anti-Semitism. This was on a Friday. Monday morning, I get a phone call from the General Secretary of the Norwegian Bible Society that the national news channel on television, our CNN, wanted me to come on and have a discussion about the live debate about the translation of hoi Judaioi, the Greek word for the Jews in the Gospel of John. And there was a headline in one of the major newspapers in Norway said, the Bible Society are taking the Jews out of the Bible.
Oh, gosh.
Oh,
And
wow.
the truth is, the word occurs like 178 places in the New
Sure,
Testament.
sure.
We've changed 11 of them.
Right.
Most of them says the Jewish leaders instead. But yeah, this is a good illustration of how things currently going on can make things blow out of proportion.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, it's been heavily debated. I think I've written 4 newspaper articles about this in the last year.
Yeah.
It's, so it shows that people's emotional response and reactions to a choice that was made long before October 7th,
Right.
but connected to it.
Right,
Yeah.
and how people's maybe their ideological commitments can. It's interesting that they can accuse you of either of opposite crimes.
Yes. Yeah.
You're either your translation is
Yeah.
somehow politically in favor of anti-Semitic sentiments, or the opposite. You're trying to
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we have been specifically, accused of trying to hide the fact that the Jews killed Jesus.
Right.
Is literal an accusation.
And then you have these these poor nerds who are just like, no, we just want to make it clear what they meant.
That's how it feels. So to
Right.
new readers, it might look odd that the Jewish people were afraid of the Jewish people. I mean,
Right.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
That would have been my first thought.
Yeah.
Was that. That's
And
a little,
interesting. That's what I've heard of the Book of John, is that it's the anti-Semitic gospel.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't. I've heard
You
people
should
who
read Mark.
Yeah, I've heard people who are smart enough that they shouldn't say something that silly.
Yeah.
Right.
And it doesn't. Yeah, I'm gonna avoid that controversy for now because that's not what I'm talking about.
Sure. Yeah, so let's thank you for bringing up that example. I want to move to one that I actually personally am curious about as well, but I also know that this is one I more or less heard on the streets that was an issue. So it's about the virgin birth.
Yeah.
Okay. So in the 2011 Norwegian Bible, I haven't read it in the 2024 yet, but in the 2011 Bible, in Matthew. Matthew chapter 1, I forget the exact verse, but Matthew says, well, Mary, was a virgin who conceived, and this was to fulfill.
27, but I'm not sure, but regardless.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's right,
127,
because it's after, that makes sense to me. And it says, this happened so the scripture may be fulfilled that the virgin would, conceive of a child. But in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14 in the 2011, it doesn't say the Norwegian word for virgin. It says young woman or young girl. So the charge or the question is like, okay, well, why did you make that change? Why does it say young woman in the Old Testament and virgin in the new one? This is kind of something you hear on like atheist YouTube as well. People bring up like, hey, well, the word in the Old Testament doesn't even say virgin. It said young woman.
Yeah.
Do you think
So why are you helping the atheists?
Right.
Yeah.
Do you think you could
Bible
unpack that for us maybe?
Pro-atheism. Absolutely. It's one of these issues that stem from translation, right? Because Matthew, or the author of Matthew, read a Greek Bible.
Right.
And a Greek Old Testament. And he uses the word in Greek that is used in Isaiah chapter 7 in the Greek translation, which is parthenon. It's the Greek word that means, it means both of the, I'll get to the issue very soon.
Sure. Yeah, they're fine.
It means something, the meaning is related to virgin. Yeah, it's close to it. And then we have the Hebrew Bible. And the Hebrew Bible uses a word called alma. And alma in Hebrew means young woman. And it's this spectrum, right? Of if these two words are on the same type, in the same semantic field, they both have connotations of young women and they both have connotations of virginity. Okay. But in the Greek word is much stronger in the aspect of virginity, and the Hebrew word is much stronger in the aspect of of being a young woman. Sure. To an extent where it could be used about someone who wasn't technically a virgin. Right? That's so if we want to be faithful to the Hebrew text, which is the one we've chosen for our Bibles, this has been the case since Jerome, then it's the best translation of the Isaiah text.
Yeah.
And what we do we do lose a link. And I think the responsibility here is on the people who are communicating this. This is on pastors, this is on preachers to know and communicate well. But if we want to do an honest and faithful translation, this is the best we can do.
Sure.
And if we had chosen the Septuagint as the basis for our Old Testament, then we should have the same word. It's definitely what the author of Matthew is looking at. But it is a bit more complicated than that. And that's because Matthew, or the author of Matthew, the text in Isaiah isn't really a prophecy, right? It doesn't, at least in the context of Isaiah, it doesn't claim to be a prophecy.
Sure.
The prophecy comes later, and the prophecy comes with Emmanuel. He will be God with us, right?
Right.
And that is the point, which I think the author of Matthew is trying to getting at, is what is happening here with Jesus is that he is God with us, right? And then he links this whole passage together to make this point. But that isn't really part of the prophecy as Isaiah sees it, right?
Sure.
So there's a lot going on here. And I think we have to have a nuanced view of this. But the issue is just that the Hebrew word, which was translated, I mean, it must have had some associations with virginity, because the Greek translators did choose the Greek word parthenon when they did it, but it's not the strongest associations when the word is used elsewhere.
Right.
And especially if you want a literal translation. The more literal you want it, the more it has to be.
So we have the prophet Isaiah writing something, and he chooses a word that has a semantic range, but the connotation is a young woman. And then it's Matthew, or the author of Matthew, which I think was Matthew. But we have, we're not committing ourselves to that, so we'll be a little bit very ecumenical about that. But then he is doing the interpretation and the expansion. And so your point is, I think your point is that if we want to have a faithful representation of the words of each of those authors, then we let Matthew be the one who's doing the interpreting, not the translation committee.
Yes, and even more so, I think this is a general thing we have to keep in mind when we see the Old Testament used in the New Testament, is that by and large, they are referring to the entire context of the quote they're talking about. So I'll just do one of my, I'll try to keep it brief. This is one of my favorite examples of this. It's Jonah. The only prophet Jesus compares himself to in the entire New Testament is Jonah. Which is odd, because Jonah is a bad prophet.
I wouldn't compare myself to Jonah. I wouldn't want to, at least.
And the authors do interpret it, they'll say things like, because Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, which is a very odd comparison. But if you read the entire story of Jonah, what is happening in Jonah? Well, Jonah is a prophet who's called to the people who are not the Jews to go and prophesy for them. And they are the ones who hear the message, and they return to God, and they transverse. And not the Jews, which is kind of the whole entire point of the Old Testament.
Exactly.
The Jews don't seem to get it.
Exactly.
And I think that when he's using this quote to the Pharisees, he's drawing the comparison to the entire book of Jonah. He is saying, well, you shall get the sign of Jonah. The sign is, I am going to the Gentiles who will believe my message, who will accept it, who will repent and come to God. So there's so much going on with the way the New Testament. So by and large, we should start by reading the Old Testament quotes in the New Testament as something that is pointing back to make a point that the Old Testament is making. And then secondary, we can talk about prophecies.
Well, and I think we tend to have kind of we call it a wooden view of prophecy, where we imagine is that there's some medium who says on this date this thing is going to happen, and here are your lucky numbers. And that doesn't seem to be how any of the New Testament authors approach prophecy at all.
Definitely not.
And so with that note, I love that so much. But just with that note, maybe zooming back in on the virgin birth thing, that explanation, that's great. But then what about, does that undermine our belief in the virgin birth? Because the idea that Jesus was born of a virgin goes back to some of the earliest Christian creeds.
Sure.
And so does this give us reason to doubt that okay, well, maybe there isn't really a prophecy about a virgin birth happening. Maybe Mary wasn't a virgin when Jesus was born. Do you think this compromises this doctrine at all?
I mean, Matthew didn't think so, it seems to me, or the author of Matthew didn't
Levi.
seem to think so, right? I mean, in the sense that the source of the doctrine isn't the prophecy, right? It's what the authors of the New Testament believed to have happened, right? And now I'm being very ecumenical in the phrase. But it's certainly so. So I don't see any reason for I don't see that as a reason for not believing in the doctrine.
Right.
Yeah.
And Matthew doesn't seem to be drawing an inference. He's not saying, well, actually, we have this prophecy from Isaiah, so therefore Mary, this lady who I actually know, right? So therefore Mary must have been a virgin when she conceived.
Right.
Like, no, he tells the whole story, and then he's able to find a referent in earlier prophecy.
Right. And in the whole story, I mean, even in Matthew 1 and in Luke 1, very clearly, Mary is a virgin. She thinks she's a virgin at least. She's not ready to consummate the marriage with Joseph. And so either in Matthew 1 or in Luke 1. And so clearly, I mean, in the beginning of those Gospels, Mary is portrayed as a virgin. So I just on a personal level totally agree. I don't think it undermines the belief in this doctrine at all. I think there's other textual reasons, maybe even stronger ones, on why we should think that Mary was a virgin when she was conceived, when she conceived Jesus. I want to move on to the next one. This is one I actually did read a few articles about. I believe this is relevant to the New Revision as well. John 3:16.
Yeah.
Who doesn't know John 3:16, right? I mean, that's like the first thing you learn when you become a Christian. You get saved, you get baptized, and you have to memorize John 3:16.
I didn't know we were going to do this. I'm so excited.
So John 3:16, you guys made a change.
Yeah.
And then you made another change in response to criticism, maybe?
That's that's right. So we made okay. So the word at issue here is the word that in all English translation is translated as perish. Whosoever believes shall have shall not perish,
but have eternal life.
So this is me translating from Norwegian into English.
No, that's fine.
And perish is a great. The Greek word here is apolimai, and that is the word that is under issue, like we're discussing. And apolimai and perish mean by and large the same thing. They have great overlap in the sense that this Greek word apolimai is used in contexts like food that goes bad, and food can perish in English. But in Norwegian, we historically we were under Denmark. We used a Danish word, which again comes from the German Luther translation of the Bible. It's fortapt. It means being lost. But it had gained a very strong theological implication in that sense that it was. We have something called. What you would have called it like the doctrine of perishing. So the doctrine of being lost, and it means in a deep theological sense, basically, even as strong as people could think of it as meaning going to hell, right? Of course, that isn't really what's behind the word perish in English, right? That's not how it's thought of in English. So to English speakers, this is easier to accept, I think. So the question we have to make, okay, then when we have used this word, and this word is not used in modern Norwegian any longer. This word being lost in the sense, and it means fortapt, it's like being eternally lost. Isn't used in any other sense in Norwegian. So we want to go back and we want to use a word that has a meaning that is still used in Norwegian. Okay, then what does the Greek word really mean? Well, it's used in so many different contexts, and it's translated even in English, in all Bible translations, even the King James Version, translated differently all the time. Dying, being destroyed, ruin, all of these words. It seems that the core meaning of the word is something along the lines of going to ruin, being destroyed. So the first suggestion we used is a Norwegian idiom, gå til grunne, which means being destroyed. But I think that has had a strong impression of being annihilationist. And people reacted very strongly to that. And the board reacted to it. So they said,
real quickly, let's just define annihilationism just real quick.
Sure.
Yeah, no, just so we have it on the table. Yeah. So annihilationism is a view of what happens to unbelievers when they die. What does the judgment look like? And so the traditional view has been that they go to a place of eternal conscious torment that's has been called hell. That's more the traditional view. But then there's another view called annihilationist, which is that they may go to hell for some period of time, or they're annihilated immediately, but they cease to exist, or they're destroyed, or something like that. They're annihilated after death. That's annihilationism.
Right, their ultimate destiny is to cease to exist altogether.
Yeah, and that's the minority view. And the more traditional view, it would be the eternal conscious torment view of hell.
And so if you're trying to be theologically neutral, maybe that first suggested term is less neutral than some would have liked.
Yeah, that's the idea. So I also personally, I'm not going to make a distinction of what happens when we die.
Sure. Yes, of course.
Because I'm not sure. But I think people felt strongly that it was it lacked nuance too much. And I think now we're acting as if the word perish is the authority here, but it is a useful tool because it has a stronger overlap, and I don't think perish carries necessarily that implication either. It probably doesn't exclude it.
Yeah, it doesn't exclude it. No. In fact, if you ask my annihilationist friends, they think it would. It does. Perish would necessitate their view. It says no. This clearly supports our view.
But then we had to go back to the drawing board, and it's like, what is a good word? Well, there are other hints in the Gospel of John. So, trying to look at each book independently, how does John use this word? And he uses it a few times, as I said, with food and things like that, going bad. But he also uses it about the sheep. So the sheep that are lost. Yes. Yeah, right. And the sheep that are lost. And to me, and I think this is a good choice, is because there seems to be a strong parallel about the sheep being lost and about people perishing rather than having eternal life, right? It's something about the invitation in. So we decided to simply go with the term to be lost.
Okay.
So that all who believe in him shall not be lost, but have eternal life. Now the advantage is that the words that we used was fortapt, and the modern translation is just tapt.
Yeah.
So it's very close semantically in every sense. The original meaning of the word fortapt was to be lost.
We don't even have to change that song very much.
So I think it's a strong translation, but it shows the issue here. It's like the theological implications. How is it interpreted? How is it received? What does it play on? And we don't have a theological principle guiding us when we do the translation. We try to keep it as close to the linguistic and ecumenical and traditional language as possible.
Yeah.
But, we have to balance these things off one another. That's the reason why, while, being destroyed was considered, we ultimately didn't land on that language.
Thank you for laying that out. That is kind of a charge I've heard against Bible translators, is when they can't decide based on the language, they decide based on theology. And it's I'm always I never know what to say when I hear that, because I'm just always come on. I would. If that was true, I would be very upset. But I don't think. I know Bible.
But it's also interesting because my impression is that biblical scholars are less certain about theology than anyone else. There is a tendency: the more you know, the less certain you are about what's right.
Then your translation makes it to pastors, and no, this theology is all wrong.
Exactly. Thank you so much for laying that out. I want to now talk about. I think it's a fun one, just because it's this is what I don't understand at all as a native English speaker who reads Norwegian, and now I'm reading John 1:14. There's another change that apparently people had lots of problems with, and so in John 1:14 in English, right, it says that the Word became flesh, and dwelt among us. But apparently, I'm just going to tell you the way that it was. I was able to translate it on my own. Sure. That sounded a little humorous to me, which is that. Okay, well now in the new revision, it kind of reads like the Word became meat.
Yeah.
That I go buy at a market. Yeah. I see svinekjøtt. I see pork meat. Yeah. And so what was that change from? Yeah. And why did you change it to what you did? Yeah.
It's a tough one. The issue here is the Greek word sarx, which is most often translated flesh in English. It's complicated because it means a lot of things and is used in a wide variety of contexts. And historically, what we did in the 1978 translation was try to find metaphors. So you'll see things like the evil nature or the sinful nature of man, like these types of translation. And it said the word became human was the choice there, and the choice in 2011. But of course, the issue is that when you do these metaphor translations all the time, you kind of lose some of the general thought behind it. You lose the same impression. The problem is that we don't have a Norwegian word equivalent to flesh. What we have is one word that means both meat and flesh. So the association to that word is quite strongly meat rather than flesh.
Sure.
And to further complicate this, again, I said we used to translate this word quite consistently to flesh meat, meat flesh. And we did that when we were under Danish rule, when we wrote Danish. And what happened is that we had this Danish word, kjød, and the Norwegian word kjøtt. And they came to mean different things. So one would be like flesh meat in the theological biblical context, and one would be like all other types of flesh meat.
Nice.
But that distinction isn't really tenable, right? Also because that's not distinction that Paul makes. So the Greek has two words, sarx meaning flesh, and then kreas, which is only used twice in the entire New Testament, but it does mean meat. We can't make that distinction really well in Norwegian. So when we said, okay, we want to make this translation more concordant, we want to translate it more strongly word for word, what should we do with this word? And we say, okay, we should use body was one of those suggestions that came in. But that brings in a very Gnostic interpretation of the body being evil. And the mind not being evil. Right. And the body in general, the soma, the Greek word, isn't used in a negative context. It's used being part of Christ. We are the church is the body is the of Christ. This kind of language is very positive. So, okay, body doesn't work. Well, the only word we have left, in all honesty, is this flesh meat word. And so we're going to use it, and it's kind of implicitly forcing people to grow accustomed to it. So, people find it challenging, and because the association is that kind of dead meat that you find in the market. But it is, it's the best of a few bad options. And some people really want to have this kjød, this Danish word. I think that's a really bad choice because we're making a distinction that isn't real and is very theologically loaded. It's also, flesh has also had the connotation, but kjød is even more so of being purely sexual.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's the negative of the sexual part of humanity. I think flesh has that to some extent.
In English,
like fleshly desires.
Yes.
Right.
Like,
but even that is like theologically, that's pretty theologically loaded
it
as
is,
well.
But I think people often hear like, that's just being horny.
Right.
Sorry,
there you go.
Yeah.
That's fine. That's a colloquial way of saying it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I get it.
For that.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
So that was the debate that was going on, and I still think this is probably the best option, but it is a complicated word. And of course, it's even more complicated than that is what did Paul especially mean by it. Because he uses, Jesus was the family of David according to the flesh. Yeah, and that's neutral. That's not negative.
Right.
So then
Exactly.
it says, but it's clear what comes from the flesh. Things like, a long list
all
of
those
bad
things
things.
in Galatians 5. Yeah.
So it's just the word itself is complicated, theologically, interpretatively complicated.
Right.
But what translation to use? Not easy.
Yeah. I think that's like super fascinating. I love that example because it really just kind of speaks to like, what do? You have to make a choice. Norwegian have these options. And I like how you said it before, we chose the best of like a list of bad options. Like, okay, how do we do this? I mean, when you talk about like should, like how that's a terrible translation or we shouldn't use that. I completely agree for like exactly the reasons you said. I mean, if I'm like witnessing to someone or if I'm reading the Bible for the first time, like with a Norwegian Christian, like a young, like brand new Norwegian Christian, And I'm trying to like explain these things that are like easy for me to understand. Because I mean, I grew up in the church. I like read the English Bible. I'm like, oh, we've got a great word for that, flesh. And I'll just, that's how I understand it. I mean, just making it simple, breaking it down for people so that like when we can understand things without all this like, intuition and theological loading. Is so important, and I just so appreciate that.
But it is a balance, right? Because if you don't use any of the the biblical traditional language, then you also lose something. So you need to keep this in constant balance. Like if you remove mercy and grace and all of these words, right? But definitely. I think there's something about being authentic and not having a specialized biblical language. Because it wasn't a specialized biblical language when they first used it. Right. That is my argument.
Right, and then and sorry, I have more to say, but I'm just not going to.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. But we'll do the follow-up episode. You can say it. No. I love your insights, Cam. But
no. You stop talking too.
Thank you so much, Julian. I super, super appreciate it. Thank you for going over at least some of the ones I thought were very important and explaining them. That was wonderful. And you listening at home, whether if you're Norwegian, first of all, I hope this makes you feel a little better about the new revision that is out and some of the revisions who have been made. And for anyone just listening at all, I hope this was fruitful for you and helped you understand the Bible better. All these episodes that we did with Dr. Julian, we just want to thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And you listening, we'll see you again next week. God bless.
Thank you for listening to Wordfirst Radio. Be sure to like, subscribe, and check us out online at wordfirst.us.